produced was denied them. A nation devastated by centuries of oppression, leaving only one export, its sons and daughters. They arrived in America with little more than strength and determination. They were described as the scattered debris of the Irish nation. Yet upon that debris, sweat and sacrifice, a new nation was built and a new identity. They said the Irish could never be loyal Americans, yet 257 recipients of the Medal of Honor list Ireland as their birthplace. They went from being marginalized to becoming voices of advocacy. They have gone from "no Irish need apply" to contributing in every field of endeavor. They are visionaries who transformed the American dream into reality, blazing a path for others to follow. They are Irish Americans, and their story is our story. March is Irish American Heritage Month.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to our fourth edition of our Irish American Heritage Month webinars. Tonight's topic is Canadian Spy Story, Irish Revolutionaries and the Secret Police. Living in Ohio, I'm on the north coast of the United States, and very interested to hear what we have to learn tonight from our friend from Toronto. But first, our national historian, Dan Taylor.
Thank you, Danny, and welcome everyone to this, our fourth webinar of Irish American Heritage Month 2023. Irish nationalism in the 19th century, both in Ireland and here in the United States, came in two broad forms. There were, on one hand, those who sought by agitation and legislation a measure of Irish autonomy within what would become the British Commonwealth. And then there were those who were committed to a more complete and violent separation, sometimes characterized as physical force republicanism. The former, more moderate form of Irish nationalism was exemplified by Daniel O'Connell, both in his success in achieving Catholic emancipation in 1829 and in his failed effort to repeal the Act of Union. In the closing decades of the century, Charles Stewart Parnell and John Redmond of the Irish Parliamentary Party were the moderates, seeking home rule for Ireland in the British Parliament. Irish nationalism of the physical force type manifested itself in the United Irishmen Rebellion of 1798 and again in 1803 with Robert Emmet's rising. Membership in the two groups, the two types of Irish nationalism, was not necessarily mutually exclusive, as physical force Republicans might support more moderate action and vice versa, depending upon the circumstances. The Young Islanders movement, for instance, split from O'Connell's Repeal Association and rose in arms in 1848. With the Great Hunger on Gorta Moor came the mass migration of the Irish to the United States, and as we will hear tonight, also to Canada. By the late 1850s, physical force republicanism was represented in the United States by the Fenian Brotherhood and in Ireland by the Irish Republican Brotherhood. Both organizations formed by veterans of 1848 and were generally known collectively as the Fenians. Any plans that the Fenians may have had were largely interrupted on April 12, 1861, when South Carolina militia opened an artillery barrage on the United States garrison at Fort Sumter. Large numbers of Irish men, some freshly arrived and others first or second generation Irish Americans, served with distinction in our Civil War, most famously in the Union Army, but also in the Confederate Army. Some viewers of tonight's webinar may recall our 2021 webinar on the Irish and the American Civil War with historian Damian Shields, and that webinar is available for viewing on our AOH YouTube channel. Many of these Irish men, in fact, were recruited to serve in Irish units in the Civil War with the express notion that they would obtain military training that could later be used to liberate Ireland. And so it was that at the conclusion of the Civil War in 1865, there was a relatively large number of Irish American men with military training, battle-hardened, available for action. Moving these men across the Atlantic to liberate Ireland would be a logistical challenge, to say the least, but there was another target closer at hand. What if Canada could be seized in exchange for Irish independence? Relations between the U.S. and Great Britain had been strained during the Civil War as it was. What if the U.S. could be drawn into conflict with the British? Such was the thinking in Fenian circles. And tonight we're going to hear about the Fenian invasions of Canada of 1866 and 1871. Now, professional historians have traditionally paid little attention to the Fenian incursions, writing them off as a sort of historical novelty or interesting footnote. Our guest tonight, Professor David Wilson of the University of Toronto, has gone a long way toward filling the void by producing a detailed but eminently accessible account, not only of the raids themselves, but of the circumstances that gave rise to them and the Canadian response. Perhaps most interestingly, Professor Wilson looks at where Irish Canadians fell on that spectrum of Irish nationalism and their response to the raids. And as reflected in the title of Professor Wilson's book, Canadian Spy Story, Irish Revolutionaries and the Secret Police, the Fenian invaders, among other obstacles, faced the traditional bane of Irish Republicans, informers. Professor Wilson is himself a modern-day Irish immigrant to Canada. Having been born in Islandmagee, County Antrim, he emigrated with his family to England, where he attended college, and then found his way to Canada, where he earned his MA and Ph.D. at Queen's University. Professor Wilson then embarked on an academic career that led him to his current position as professor in the history department of the University of Toronto. His academic interests include the Irish in North America, revolutionary and conservative movements, state security and civil liberty, religion, and nationalism. I am pleased to introduce our guest tonight, Professor David Wilson.
Well, thank you very much, Dan, and it's great to be here. It's an honor to be part of your webinar series, and to be able to spend some time talking about Canadian Spy Story, Irish Revolutionaries, and the Secret Police. So what I'm going to do this evening is to begin by talking a little about the making of the book and some of the themes within the book. And then I'll read a short excerpt from it to give you a sense of the style and a sense of the content of the book. Now, one reader commented that reading Canadian Spy Story was akin to looking at a Hieronymus Bosch painting. Both, he said, are full of vignettes, sometimes bizarre, sometimes surprising, always striking, and always connected to the whole. So, if you like, Hieronymus Bosch meets the Fenians. Not, of course, that such an encounter could ever have happened, but a renowned Canadian historian, one of Canada's greatest historians from the 1950s and 1960s, did meet the Fenians, and he did not like what he found. Writing of the attempted Fenian invasion of Canada in 1866, Donald Creighton made his views characteristically clear. I quote, "Nothing could have been more characteristically Irish," which he puts in inverted commas, "nothing could have been more characteristically Irish in the broadest, most farcical meaning of the word than the conception and execution of this great enterprise, the attempted invasion. With one or two significant exceptions," he continues, "with one or two significant exceptions, the leaders of the Fenian movement against British America were a crew of grandiloquent clowns and vainglorious incompetents." Donald Creighton. Now, I've taken a rather different approach, and I've reached rather different conclusions, although I must say there were a fair few grandiloquent clowns and vainglorious incompetents in the cast of characters. But my study emerged as a spin-off from a biography that I'd written of a young Islander, Thomas D'Arcy McGee, one of the leaders of the Rising of 1848, who emerged through a variety of vicissitudes as a father of Canadian Confederation, a liberal conservative father of Confederation, who was one of the main movers actually in improving separate school legislation for Irish Catholics in Canada. So in writing this biography of D'Arcy McGee, I began to get a sense of how the Fenian movement was operating in Canada, and also the Canadian government's responses to the Fenians. So I began to develop a different angle of vision to view the Fenians. Most historians beforehand from Canada who'd looked at this subject had framed it in terms of the extent to which the invasions contributed to Canadian Confederation in 1867, when 4 provinces, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Quebec, and Ontario, came together to form Canada. So most historians, wrote about the Fenian invasion, invasion attempts, creating a reaction of Canadian nationalism, which fed into the movement for Confederation. And ironically, the argument runs, the very attempt of the Fenians to bust apart the British North American Empire actually wound up consolidating and strengthening it. Now, I wanted to look at the Fenians from a different angle. And I do have the military campaigns of 1866 and another one in 1870 and a smaller one in present-day Manitoba in 1871. I do have these in the book. They are discussed, but they're not actually central to what I'm attempting to do. Instead, first of all, I've attempted to show that the Fenian invasion strategy wasn't nearly as wrong-headed or bizarre as it appears in retrospect, and indeed as it appeared to many Irish nationalists at the time. I mean, James Stephens, who was the chief officer of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, regarded the Fenian raids as a mad and treacherous diversion from the cause. So there were serious critics within Irish nationalism at the time. But can you still see me?
Yes.
Yeah, good. Okay, my screen just changed. So this is part of the view that we have, this notion that the Fenian invasions were utterly bizarre. And you find this in the historiography, not only with the Donald Creighton quotation I gave you earlier, but also in the constant reiteration of the phrase comic opera to describe what happened in 1866 and again in 1870. So I want to try, first of all, to put ourselves in the position of someone, say, in a bar in Manhattan, across the table from a Fenian who's come from Ireland, who's experienced the famine, or who knows people who've experienced the famine. He's well-read, he's thought a lot about the strategy, and he's trying to persuade you that the invasion strategy is going to be an effective one. So the first thing we have to note here is that our imaginary person across the table in this Manhattan bar would be driven by a deep desire to avenge the horrors of the famine by striking at the British Empire. And I don't think we can underestimate the importance of the desire for revenge, particularly given the helplessness that so many people experienced during the famine, and indeed on the ships carrying them across the Atlantic, those who survived. So as Dan mentioned, Anglo-American relations were already at a very low point at this stage, 1865, 66. Britain was tacitly supporting the Confederates during the Civil War. Some New York newspapers were calling immediately after the Civil War for a new war against Britain. So it seemed that there was potential to provoke an Anglo-American war. And an Anglo-American war could create the space for revolution in Ireland. And this was actually a central aim. This is what our man across the bar in Manhattan would tell us, that England's difficulty is Ireland's opportunity. He would quote Wolfe Tone from the 1790s. England's difficulty was expected to take place in a war with France, but that hadn't materialized. But Anglo-American relations were in a state of tension, prospective crisis. During the Civil War, Britain and the United States had very nearly gone to war. In December of 1861, Britain had actually sent 10,000 troops across the Atlantic. And when they arrived in Canada in the winter of 1861, and they had to walk through 600 miles of snow to get to the first railway station. So clearly the British took this seriously. Now, the Fenians, a man across the bar, believed that they had the tacit support of the American government. They believed that President Johnson and Secretary of State William Seward would, quote, acknowledge accomplished facts. They believed that because that's what their leaders said. Seward told them that the American government would acknowledge accomplished facts. They also believed that French Canadians, here we have fellow Catholics trapped in a Protestant British Empire, that French Canadians would remain neutral, that they would not fight for a British Protestant Empire. They believed that Irish Catholic Canadians would not oppose them, and in some cases would actively work with them. They also believed that if they could hold Canadian territory for just a few days, that's all it would take, then thousands upon thousands of Irish Americans, veterans of the Civil War, would rush to the front. It would be like iron filings going to a magnet. The act of holding Canada would simultaneously prompt Britain to send troops across the Atlantic and would inspire the revolutionary organization in Ireland, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, to action. So this is what the man across the bar would tell you if we could go back to 1865. And I must say, these beliefs were not simply plucked out of the air. They all seemed plausible at the time. And I think hindsight can be a real problem for historians. We have to think our way into the lives of the people who've experienced the famine, who are looking for revenge, who believe there's an opportunity here, and who have these assumptions. Some of them, as I say, seemed plausible, and some were completely accurate. I mean, thousands more would have rushed to the frontier had the Americans not stopped them. And that's something we can get into in the Q&A. And inspiring the folks back home? Absolutely. Let me give you an example of that. Dan mentioned the constitutional nationalist movement and the physical force movement, and quite rightly said that they weren't totally distinct entities, that there were times when they could form coalitions. Well, in 1866, the leading Irish nationalist newspaper was a constitutional nationalist paper, The Nation. If you look at The Nation, the week before the Fenian invasion, in May 31st, June 1st of 1866, you look at the copy of The Nation beforehand, and they're condemning the Fenians. They're condemning the Fenian plans for an invasion. They say it's a disgrace to the cause of Irish nationalism and no one should support it. Now you go the week after the Battle of Ridgeway, when the Fenians actually scored a victory over the forces of the Crown, mainly militia who never fired a shot in anger, and many of whom actually were University of Toronto students in the militia. But it was still a victory over the forces of the Crown. The Nation newspaper, which 2 weeks earlier had condemned the Fenians, was now ecstatic about the great victory that the Fenians had had in Ridgeway, in the Niagara Peninsula. Said it was the greatest triumph of Ireland in arms since the Battle of Castlebar during the Rising of 1798. Others said the Battle of Fontenoy in 1745. And if this is how constitutional nationalists reacted, you could imagine how physical force Republicans reacted. So the notion that a victory in Canada could inspire the folks back home was completely accurate. But their other assumptions were either completely or partially wrong. The American government may have informed the Fenian leadership in November of 1865 that they would acknowledge accomplished facts when it came to an invasion, but actually the government had no intention of allowing those facts to be accomplished in the first place. The French Canadian radicals who assured the Fenians that the French Canadians as a whole would remain neutral, were engaging in that perennial radical fallacy of wishful thinking. French Canada was a very conservative, politically and socially and religiously conservative society. And the idea of throwing your lot in with Protestant America when you actually had a pretty good deal of protecting your language, protecting your education system, protecting your legal system within British North America, they were not prepared to throw their lot in with the Fenians. When it came to Irish Catholic Canadians, most were either neutral or hostile to a Fenian invasion, either neutral or hostile. But a significant minority, in my estimation, somewhere between, well, somewhere probably around 10%, were very much in favor of a Fenian invasion. And so this takes me to my second major theme. I'm just giving you three of them this evening. The second major theme, rather than seeing Fenianism simply as an external threat, which is how Canadians viewed it, Fenians coming in from the United States to attack them, I came to realize that there was actually a widespread underground secret Fenian organization within Canada. Not only that, its most militant members were planning to burn down government buildings, to blow up bridges, to subvert the militia and the army, to spike guns, to poison horses, to seize hostages in the service of a Fenian invasion. They were planning to coordinate their activities, internal subversion, with a Fenian invasion. And so for me, tracing the activities of Canadian Fenians and trying to assess their degree of support proved to be one of the most challenging and most absorbing elements of the research. And it was actually helped by archival sources in the United States because it became possible through such sources to uncover American Fenian connections with their Canadian counterparts. And there was, I learned, a Fenian Secret Service. That's what they called it, Fenian Secret Service. It was running agents into Canada to coordinate plans to aid and abet the Irish Republican Army. And that is also what they called it, the Irish Republican Army. But the best set of sources came from the newly formed Canadian Secret Police Force, which, when read against the grain, shed considerable light on Fenian operations in both Canada and the United States. But you could also, though, read the Canadian secret police sources with the grain, not only against the grain, and acquire major insights into the way the secret police operated on both sides of the border. And that's my third broad theme for this evening. For me, this was the most exciting part of the research. Hardly anything had been done on the subject, the origins and activities of the Canadian Secret Police Force in the mid-1860s. I mean, there was an MA thesis on the use and misuse of secret service funds. There were a couple of articles, one of which was very good, but no one had explored the operations of the Canadian Secret Police at length. And the deeper I got into the subject, the more fascinating and the more surprising it became. Now, the central source, the spine of the research, if you like, was actually very easy to access, or it became very easy to access. It comes from the papers of the Prime Minister at the time, John A. Macdonald. In his papers, a library and archives in Ottawa in Canada, there are some 3,000 letters on the Fenians, 3,000, now available all on microfilm. Most of them now available all online, digitized. They were microfilmed, they're now online. And most of these 3,000 letters consist of reports from detectives in the field to their handlers up to MacDonald himself, who micromanaged the whole strategy, tactics, and then back down against the chain. Now, this was an historian's goldmine, and it had never been fully excavated. These letters provided a detailed record of the formation of the secret police, of its frustrations and its failures, of its attempts to infiltrate the Fenian leadership, and its eventual success in doing so. And in the process, I encountered an extraordinary set of individual stories, the vignettes from Hieronymus Bosch, if you like, a series of characters who were motivated by everything ranging from patriotism and idealism to ambition, to cynicism, to greed, or a combination of some or all of the above. A few were already well known to historians. The monomaniac John O'Neill, who led the Fenian army into the Niagara Peninsula and won that victory over the Canadian militia in June of 1866. John O'Neill would still be planning an invasion of Canada today if he was still alive. I mean, he never gave up on that. He once said he did, but he never did. You'd encounter another one who's well known, the chain-smoking Thomas Billis Beach, this Englishman who adopted a faux French accent, renamed himself Henri Lacaron, and rose to become the adjutant general of the Irish Republican Army, and getting paid simultaneously by the Canadian Secret Service, the British Home Office, and the Fenian Brotherhood. But others I'd never heard of before, not least Charles Clarke, Canada's best detective. And if ever there was a candidate for an anti-hero, an egregious individual in a Netflix series, Charles Clarke is your man. He was adept at informing on not only the Fenians with whom he worked, but also some of his fellow detectives, and indeed betraying various women he encountered during his travels. Charles Clarke was a Catholic who'd converted to Protestantism in Ireland, either during or immediately after the famine. He joined the secret police after being fired from the regular Toronto police force because, as he put it, of, quoting Charles Clarke himself now, a malicious charge of a lewd girl for having improper connection with her. I mean, if it was a malicious charge, one wonders why he was fired, but that was his take. Charles Clarke managed to get right to the top of the Fenian Brotherhood, only to come crashing down after seducing and abandoning one of his niece's friends by the name of Miss Clapp. All I can find out about her, don't know who she is, don't know her first name, but I do know she got her revenge by discovering his true identity and outing him to the Fenian Brotherhood. And at this point, I think I became seduced myself, seduced by all the stories I was uncovering. But despite the title of the book, history is not a story per se. It is above all an inquiry. And in this case, it is an inquiry that's embedded in the narrative. And with that in mind, I'll spend a few minutes, maybe 5 minutes, maybe no more than 10 at the most, probably about 5 minutes, just reading you an excerpt from the conclusion, the opening section of the conclusion of the book. And the title of the chapter that concludes the book is called Contrary to All Expectations, because indeed, so much that I discovered was contrary to all my expectations. It is easy to be seduced by the story. Against the backdrop of the famine in Ireland, the Civil War in the United States, and Confederation in Canada, Irish revolutionaries in North America searched for ways to undermine the British Empire and to secure Irish independence. Some want to focus their attention directly on Ireland by raising money, running guns, or returning to help their fellow revolutionaries. Others believe that the best route to Irish freedom is through Canada, by launching an invasion, triggering an Anglo-American war, annexing Canada to the United States, and inspiring the revolutionary movement back home. Members of each side view the others as traitors to the cause, so much so that in some instances, men who reject the Canadian strategy are willing to inform on their rivals. What they all share, though, is a passionate Irish patriotism and a passionate hatred of British rule in Ireland. Historians can argue about underlying motivations, whether Irish nationalism in North America was driven by a quest for acceptance in the host society, was brought over on the boats, or some combination of both. But sometimes it is worth listening to what people actually say and taking it seriously. The messages from Irish Republicans in North America are clear and emphatic. A foreign government rules our country. An alien aristocracy possesses our property. Our once fair and free land has been ground down under the Saxon heel for the past 700 years, and this state of affairs cannot and must not be endured any longer. The Great Hunger offered further proof of British malevolence. It was the Great Hunger, not the famine, because in this version of history, there was no real famine in Ireland. There was enough food to feed everyone, but the landlord sent the grain out of the country, and the government let the Irish starve to death, glad to see that the surplus population was being reduced. This was a worldview that was most famously articulated by John Mitchell, and it saturated Fenian discourse, from pubs to speeches to clubs to family gatherings. It was transmitted to the next generation through songs, as well as stories told by old men or learned at a mother's knee, and it has resonance to this day. All the revisionist scholarship in the world cannot dent it. It has the imperviousness of religious orthodoxy. Open up any popular book on 19th century Irish American history, and you're likely to find an introductory chapter that compresses 700 years of English oppression into 7 pages, and a conclusion in which a history of failed Irish struggles for freedom ends with the redemptive power of the Easter Rising of 1916 and a new beginning, albeit with business left undone. These messages matter. Now, add in the fact that many of those men who became Fenians and their families who supported them had harrowing experiences of the famine, of evictions, of the terrifying voyage across the Atlantic, and of the challenges of coping in a strange and unfamiliar world. And many of those who did not have such experiences knew people who did. Imagine the feelings of guilt. The young Jeremiah O'Donovan Rosser eating his penny bun without sharing it. The feelings of helplessness and despair, the anger, the blame, and the desire for revenge. If we're looking for motivation, it is surely here that we must look. We underestimate the emotional power of these direct experiences and that worldview at our peril. The poor servant girls who gave their pennies to the Fenian Brotherhood were not ignorant and deluded dupes, as their detractors claimed. They were trying to do something, however small, to rectify what they saw as terrible wrongs. There were fools and knaves among the Fenian head centers, no doubt, and there were chancers and conmen who were quite prepared to line their own pockets at the expense of others. But the movement was given direction by leaders who shared the feelings and attitudes of the rank and file, and who sought to give them strategic meaning, even as they fought over what that meaning was or should be. That the fight could become so bitter only testified to their belief that the stakes were so high. They believed that the future of Ireland hinged on their decisions and their actions. I'll just go on for a couple more minutes about Canada. In Canada, the Fenians were in a tougher position than their counterparts in the United States. although no tougher than those in Ireland, Britain, Australia, and New Zealand. In the United States, being a revolutionary Republican ran with the grain, at least in theory. In the British Empire, it cut against the grain, in theory and in practice. If you wanted to be an Irish nationalist and a good Canadian, you had to follow the path of Daniel O'Connell, as did Thomas D'Arcy McGee. For Irish Canadians, in the tradition of Wolfe Tone, Robert Emmet, and John Mitchell, life was anything but easy. You risked losing your job, your place of business could be targeted, and you were hemmed in by hostile Orange men on one side and a disapproving Catholic Church on the other. You lived your life with one eye over your shoulder, discreet or defiant when outside your community, and free to be yourself when within it. It was not a course that you would choose lightly. No wonder then that places such as Toronto produced some of the most militant Fenians in the Atlantic world. No wonder that Patrick Boyle, editor of the Irish Canadian newspaper, publicly claimed to know nothing about Fenianism while spreading the message in his newspaper and privately selling Fenian bonds to raise money for the cause. And no wonder that Fenian circles operated under the cover of Hibernian benevolent societies and other organizations with innocuous names. They could hardly have done otherwise. So I will leave it there and now open this up for any comments and questions that you may have. And I look forward to a discussion with you.
Thank you very much, Professor Wilson. And I think you've given a good overview and a flavor of the book for those people in our audience today. You started us off with the notional man in a Manhattan bar, this Irish immigrant who was listening to a Fenian organizer. I wonder, are there any differences that you find in your research, whether on this book or otherwise, in the experience of an Irish immigrant to Canada at around the same time, as far as the reception, received when crossing the Atlantic, and all of these background issues that you have explained to us come to bear on people's beliefs? Was the Canadian experience for Irish immigrants different in any material way?
It was, yes. Canada was actually significantly different in a number of ways. First of all, most Irish migrants to Canada came before the famine, and after the mid-1850s, Irish migration to Canada really was reduced to a trickle. And that actually is a very important thing to keep in mind when comparing the Canadian and American experiences, because, of course, in the United States, new generations kept replenishing and reinvigorating the Irish nationalist movement. In Canada, it tended to be something that was multi-generational, and also numbers were smaller too. Also, I think another factor to keep in mind is that about 60% of the Irish who came to Canada were Protestant. And not all of them, of course, were Orange men, but during the 19th century, the Orange Order became extremely powerful in Canada. I mean, for a century, every mayor of Toronto, the city from which I'm speaking, was an Orange man. That only ended in 1954. 1954. In the early 20th century, it's been estimated that 1 out of every 3 adult Protestant males was a member of the Orange Order. So that was also a very different situation. Thirdly, in the time of the Fenians, about 80% of Irish migrants to Canada lived in rural areas rather than in cities. So I think that's also a significant difference, because it's harder to mobilize in rural areas. At the same time, those who came to Montreal, for example, or Quebec City, were particularly in Quebec City. I mean, there were orange lodges in both places, but they weren't nearly as powerful as they were in Ontario. They were much freer to express themselves, and the Fenian movement did indeed flourish in Quebec City and Montreal. And we move into Ontario. It's the politics of an embattled religious and cultural minority. And I mentioned during my talk, during my reading rather, that Toronto had a reputation for producing some of the most militant Irish nationalists in the Atlantic world, and they did. Let me give you some examples of that. I'll give you three examples. The three young men in 1858 who were almost certainly at a St. Patrick's Day parade, which wound up in a riot between Orange men and the paraders, and a Catholic, a young man by the name of Matthew Sheedy, was stabbed to death. And the police, who were mainly Orange men, had great difficulty in identifying any Protestant rioters, but no problem at all in identifying Catholic rioters or defenders against Orange men. And in this environment, this is when actually, shortly after this, the Hibernian Benevolent Society was formed, and it became the vehicle through which Fenianism came to Canada. And the three young men in question, I just want to give you very brief biographical profiles of them. One was a man named Murtagh Moriarty, and Murtagh Moriarty was originally from County Kerry, and he joined the Civil War, went to America, fought in the Civil War, had some of his face blown off, part of his nose was missing, went to Ireland in 1866, 67, with the task of organizing the Fenian Rising in Kerry. He was discovered, I mean, you mentioned informers earlier, an informer tipped off the authorities. He was easy to recognize. He was imprisoned. And he was the subject of one of the most famous or notorious sermons in Irish history. The Bishop of Kerry, David Moriarty, no relation to Murtagh, said, with Murtagh Moriarty very much in mind, hell is not hot enough and eternity is not long enough for such miscreants who come here to disturb the peace of our country. Murtagh Moriarty. Second one I want to mention is Edward Condon, Edward Omar Condon, also in Toronto in 1858. Edward Omar Condon also fights in the Civil War on the Union side and goes to Cork to help organize the Fenian Rising in 1867 there. He then moves to Manchester, becomes a Fenian commander in Manchester, and in the course of successfully freeing a Fenian leader from custody, he is charged with murder, along with 4 other people, 3 of whom will eventually be hanged. And he's sentenced to death for his part in this rescue attempt in which a policeman was killed. And Edward Omar Condon, in his speech from the dock, spoke the words that resonated through Fenianism and then more generally through Irish nationalism in Ireland: God save Ireland. And of course, the Sullivan brothers turned this into a song, which you probably all know: God save Ireland, say the heroes, God save Ireland, say them all. I mean, it became Ireland's unofficial national anthem until another unofficial national anthem took over, The Fields of Athenry, but it's still sung today. And then the third one is William Mackay Lomini. William Mackay Lomini was also in Cork in 1867, and actually after the failure of the Rising, didn't give up. He ran a guerrilla campaign, which was stopped when he was caught by the police. He actually shot the policeman, killed the policeman who was trying to arrest him, or one of the policemen. He got off a murder charge on the grounds that his gun had gone off accidentally. He was imprisoned, and upon his release, went back to the States, and with Edward Omar Condon, also now back in the States, helped to plot the bomb campaign, the dynamite campaign against Britain in the 1880s, designed to bomb Britain out of Ireland. And William Mackay Lomini, in the winter of 1884, went with 2 other people to place a bomb under London Bridge, and the bomb went off prematurely, and all 3 of them were blown to smithereens. But I think, I think this says a lot. I'm not saying that Toronto was the only cause, and that riot was the only cause of them becoming militant revolutionary Republicans. The reality is more complicated than that, but it was part of the story. And as I say, if you're going to be a Fenian in the United States, it wasn't very risky, really. I mean, you could go to the parades, you could be pretty public about your views. You could compare yourself to Jefferson and Washington, and you could and did say, you in America had a revolution about tea. We've had far worse things to deal with than that in Ireland, so our revolution is even more justified than yours. You could do all of that in the States. You couldn't do any of that in Canada. You had to operate this secret underground world, and it was likely to bring out the most militant characters.
And I know you've limited your points that you wanted to make tonight in the interest of time, but can you give us just a very brief something on the balance between national security and individual liberties that you came across in doing this work?
Yeah, this is actually what got me into the project in many ways to begin with, and I'm glad you asked that question because it's not often picked up on, but it's a crucial part of what I'm doing. So here's the thing: you have an ethno-religious minority in English-speaking Canada, i.e., Irish Catholics. Within that ethno-religious minority, which is largely an immigrant community as well, I think it's very important to keep in mind, you have small cadres of revolutionaries who wish to subvert the state and who are operating with revolutionaries outside the country in Ireland and the United States, but mainly the United States. And so the question for the Canadian government becomes, well, how do we isolate and defeat the militants, the revolutionary minority, without alienating the ethno-religious majority as a whole? And now the key person to watch here is the Canadian Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, who was extremely savvy about this. Now, he was actually an orange man, although a nominal orange man. He could have taken the "I'm going to energize my base" position. I mean, he could have stirred up the orange men and gone full tilt against Irish Catholics and the Fenian minority within. But he refused to do that, partly on grounds of principle and partly on grounds of pragmatism. He deliberately, and I have this from him, this isn't inferred, this is actually explicit in one of the letters that he wrote. You have him deliberately downplaying the extent of the Fenian Brotherhood in Canada. Let me read you the quotation, because it's one of the quotations that I start the book off with, and it's I think a very, very revealing one. I can just find it here. Yeah. The Fenian organization has gone to a very large and dangerous extent in Canada, although I said as little about it as possible. There is no intention of arresting people on suspicion. On the contrary, I endeavor as much as possible to keep matters quiet. Now, why did he take that position? He took it because the last thing he wanted was an orange backlash against Catholics in general, because this ran the risk of plunging Canada into, an Irish-style ethno-religious conflict. It would also mean that Irish Catholics whose vote he had been cultivating would turn away from the Conservative Party, of which he was the leader, very, very quickly indeed. And he didn't want that to happen. And he also knew that the greater degree of persecution that Irish Catholics in Canada faced, the stronger the Fenians in the United States would become. And indeed, a flow of Irish Catholic refugees from Orange persecution into the United States would have been one of the best things that could have ever happened to the Fenian Brotherhood. They could paint perfidious Albion in its blackest hues and garner support that way. And also, I think with Macdonald, there was also an element of principle involved. Yes, habeas corpus was suspended. Yes, civil liberties were violated, but he was very, very controlling in the way that this matter was handled. He did not want local magistrates to have any control over arresting people with the suspension of habeas corpus. Everything had to be cleared through him. He didn't want any mail to be intercepted unless he authorized it himself. When one judge actually in St. Catharines in Southwest Ontario wrote to him and said, there are Fenians in my area. I want to arrest them. Should I? Macdonald says, no, this is a country of law and order, and we don't just arrest people on suspicion. You keep an eye on them, but don't arrest them unless they do something wrong. So I found that very striking about MacDonald, who has come in for serious criticism, justifiably so, for his policies on indigenous peoples. But in this respect, partly through principle and partly through pragmatism, he took the very opposite course of energizing the Orange base and declaring sort of open war on Irish Catholics in Canada. And I think that was a very shrewd move. And I also think it was the correct move.
It sounds like a contrast to the traditional British reaction in Ireland as far as rounding up the usual suspects and that sort of thing. So it may have been a wise move by MacDonald. We have a question from YouTube. Maybe you can shed some light on this, maybe not. But the question asks how the Orange Order or Orange Lodges in Canada, what their relationship was with the Catholic French Canadians. Was there any interaction, problems?
That's a very good question too. I say the Orange Order. First of all, there was no love lost between French Canadians and the Orange Order, and that remains the case to this day. If ever I mention the Orange Order to French Canadians I meet in pubs or socially, I get an earful straight away. So there's no love lost. And now the Orange Order in Canada now is so small that the animus is more historical than present. I mean, there are hardly any Orange men left in Canada, in complete contrast to the early 20th century. When it comes to French Canada and the Orange men, the Orange men were didn't necessarily have much direct contact with French Canada, but French Canada for them was a warning to Ireland, because the more that French Canada tried to expand beyond Quebec, which they certainly tried to do. Canada was supposed to be a country for both French and English. The more they tried to expand beyond Quebec, the more the message went to Protestants back in Ireland. See what happens here. See what's happening here. It's going to happen to you. They're going to try and take over your areas as well. And of course, all the stereotypes about lazy, feckless, superstitious Catholics were applied to the French by the Orange Order. And so because Quebec was a more rural society than Ontario, this was seen as an example, an illustration of Catholic inferiority. And that was also relayed back to the Orange Order back home. So French Canada served as basically a warning and as a target of traditional Orange stereotypes, which were transferred quite easily from Irish Catholics to French Canadians.
Well, Professor, I want to thank you for being with us tonight. This was very informative. The book is Canadian Spy Story, Irish Revolutionaries and the Secret Police. I got my copy on Amazon. I know it's available there and at other retailers. And I'm going to now turn the panel back over to our national president, Danny O'Connell, for some final remarks.
Thank you. Thank you both, David and Dan. It was a very educational evening for us all. I had told everybody online, if you have a question or a comment, raise your hand before we leave. Tim Noonan from Chicago is stepping in today and running all our digital work. Thank you, Tim, for your help. And hearing no questions, we're going to move to our close. Thank you all. After the 15th of next month, we plan on having an event about Liam Lynch. I will be in Ireland for one of the many commemorations, and Dan's working with one of the keynote speakers at two of the commemorations to come on and speak to us here in the United States and around the world. One of the things we know about Liam Lynch, when he died in battle, that in essence ended the Civil War. So very important part of Irish history. We look forward to hearing from that next month. Tim, you want to move to the close?
As down the glen one Easter morn to a city fair bells rang out in the foggy dew. Right proudly high in Dublin town hung there the flag of war. For 'twas better to die 'neath an Irish sky than at Suvla or Sudelbar. And from the plains of royal meads strong men came hurrying through, while Britannia's Huns with their long-range guns sailed in through the foggy dew. Our bravest fell, and the requiem bell rang mournfully and clear for those who died at Eastertide in the springing of the year. How the world did gaze with deep amaze at those fearless men, but few, who bore the fight that freedom's light might shine through the foggy dew. And back through the glen I rode again, and my heart with grief was sore. For I parted then with valiant men, whom I never shall see more. But to and fro in my dreams I go, and I kneel and pray for you. For slavery fled, all glorious dead, when you fell in